This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 948, recorded on October 12, 2022. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from Ann Arbor, Michigan, Kathy Spindler.
Hi, everybody. Here it's 71 Fahrenheit, 22 Celsius, and it's supposedly heavy rain throughout the day, but right now it's not raining, but there's big stuff coming.
Big stuff coming. That's a very precise forecast. Big stuff coming. I like that. Also joining us from Austin, Texas, Rich Condit.
Hi, everybody. 94 degrees and bright sunshine. We're not out of it yet. I keep thinking we're out of it, and then we're not.
I did a TWiV with Nels Elde yesterday, and they've had like 15 days of 100-plus weather out there in Salt Lake.
Salt Lake?
Yeah, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, I was surprised. I was very surprised. Also joining us from Madison, New Jersey, Breanne Barker.
Hi, great to be here. No 100-degree weather in New Jersey. In fact, we have 71 just like Kathy, and it's pretty nice and sunny out there.
We have a guest for you today. In fact, this is a special midweek recording. We haven't done that in a while. He has been on TWiV before, and he is the author of the newly published book, Breathless. David Quammen, welcome back.
Thank you, Vincent. Good to be back. Good to see you again. Good to see all three of you others, Rich, Kathy, and Breanne. Oh, and that's 61
I want to know what the
degrees,
temperature is.
61 degrees and sunny in Bozeman, Montana. The leaves are golden. The breeze is cool, and it could snow any minute.
Okay.
Wow.
So at 61, that means it's 16 Celsius. It's the palindromic pair, the other palindromic pair of 28 and 82.
Oh, okay. All right. 61. Well, yeah.
You store that away.
That I can remember. That's about all I can remember about the conversion.
So David was last on TWiV 408, which was in September 2016. It was Alan and me and David at the Needle in Boston. We actually recorded in one of their training rooms. You remember that, David?
Yeah. Paul Dupre was around that day, I think, too.
He was.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
And the episode title was, of course,
others.
Boston Commons.
Yeah.
Quammens. That was Alan's, of course.
Of course.
All right. So this book just came out, I guess, a couple of weeks ago. It's Breathless, The Scientific Race to Defeat a Deadly Virus. This is what we're going to talk about today. But first...
It came out a week ago.
1 week ago.
Yeah.
1 week ago.
Yes.
And I pounded it down pretty quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
I finished listening at 7 a.m. today.
I finished late last night.
No, I got my copy a couple of weeks ago, so I'm very lucky to have an early one. And we're going to talk about that. But first, David, remind us, here. This is a very simple question for you. How did you become a science writer?
I drifted into it after having started my writing career as a fiction writer, as a novelist. I did very little academic training in science, but I was always interested in natural science. I was always on the fence, but I had great teachers who led me toward literature, led me toward being an English major as an undergraduate, graduate work on William Faulkner, published one novel, came to Montana in 1973, and then discovered how hard it is to make a living as a fiction writer. And I also discovered that I was really more interested in nonfiction, particularly scientific nonfiction, once I started reading it, and reinvented myself as a magazine writer, writing natural history essays, and then gradually my natural history essays became more and more informed by the actual science that I was reading, ecology and evolutionary biology in particular, and eventually started writing not just magazine articles, but books, extended works in scientific nonfiction. First of all, ecology and evolutionary biology, and then when I realized that emerging viruses are all about ecology and evolutionary biology, I started writing about them.
So how did you learn your science? You just sort of, on-the-job training, I guess, huh?
Exactly. Yeah, it's been a journalistic beat for 40 years. I have, as I said, very little academic training in science, but I read. I read journal articles. I read history of science. I read the classics, the classic books in the biological literature, and like other autodidacts, I would give myself away by the fact that learning all this stuff in the privacy of my office, I knew things, but I didn't know how to pronounce things.
That's great.
So
that's great.
I've fixed that a bit, but you can always tell an autodidact because he or she might not know the right pronunciations because they've learned
RNA polymerase, right? RNA polymerase.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly that sort of thing. I'm still struggling with whether to say virulent or virulent.
Yeah.
Well, I struggle with primer or primer.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, but those are two different pronunciations for two different word meanings, so that's okay.
Tell me, so which is which?
Well, to me, a primer is like an early book on something. It goes all the way back to, Dick, Jane, and Sally is a primer.
Okay.
Or, and then a primer is an oligonucleotide or something
that starts something.
In painting, you have to prime your walls.
The stuff you squirt into your carburetor.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Anyway, so I've been practicing
David,
without a license as an explainer of science for all these years.
I'm curious to know how difficult it was to get going as a writer. I mean, at some point you said, "Okay, I'm going to be a writer," and then all of a sudden the money started rolling in. Is that right?
Not exactly that way, no. There was a 12 or 13 year period in there when I was a bartender and a waiter and a fishing guide and a ghostwriter and doing those sorts of things that you do. The only difference in my case was that I spent those dues paying years between my first book and my second book rather than before my first book. So I published the first novel young, straight out of college, had a story, wrote it competently, was fortunate, had it published by a nice publisher, Alfred Knopf in New York. And then after that book, I really learned how hard it is to be published as a writer, B, to make a living at it.
Was there a publication or an event then that allowed you to really drop all that other stuff and become a full-time writer?
Well, there was actually, yeah. In 1980, I think it was, as I was just groping with how to be a freelancer and getting a few assignments and writing a few book reviews and things, I was invited to become the natural science columnist for Outside Magazine, an outdoor sport adventure magazine, Outside Magazine. And so, and they needed a science columnist, and for some reason they thought I could be it. So I wrote one piece for them, and they said, "Hey, we love this. Why don't you be our new science columnist?" It was a piece about the redeeming merits of the mosquito, and so I said, "Okay, I could probably do that for a year or two. Write, wacky natural history essays for a magazine that has an audience of 250,000 backpackers and mountain climbers." And it ended up being 15 years, and I won the National Magazine Award one year, and that column was always enough for me to pay my monthly nut on my little ramshackle rented house or wherever I was. And then it gave me the opportunity then to spend the other 3 weeks of the month working on other things. I'd write the column in a week, and then I'd spend 3 weeks working on a book or something else.
Okay, cool.
What type of fiction were you writing before you started doing your science writing?
My first book was a book about community organizers in a black neighborhood on the west side of Chicago in 1968. It was about a friendship between a black kid and a white kid. I had been a community organizer in Chicago, so it was loosely autobiographical, but I created a real plot. I used people that I knew as basis for characters, and so that was it. But then I also, as I was groping around, I'm turning off my email program so it doesn't go boing boing. I wrote 2 spy novels. I wrote 2 historically based espionage novels that were published in the 80s. One of which, titled "The Soul of Victor Tronco," has actually been republished by Nancy Pearl, America's librarian, in her series of lost classics. So I have the distinction of having written a spy novel that disappeared so quickly when it was first published that it later achieved respectability as a lost classic.
It's great. So, David, do you think you have any Faulkner influence in your writing?
Oh, that's a slow ball right over the plate, Vincent. Yes, yeah, I did. I was obsessed with William Faulkner and his novels for years, 11 or 12 years. I did my graduate work at Oxford University on Faulkner. I obsessed over the structure of his complicated novels, such as Absalom, and The Sound and the Fury, and Light in August, and a few others. And I've said elsewhere that probably one of the things that's been most useful to me in structuring longish, complicated nonfiction books about science and the history of science has been my close study of Faulkner. Learning how to create a structure, an intricate structure that works and serves a complicated subject with lots of threads going on, and yet isn't so orderly that it's boring. I hate orderly structures in books. I like more tangled structures, and that comes probably to some degree straight from Faulkner.
I think you definitely had to do that in this book, because you would go with a particular topic for a while through time, and then you had to go back in time when you were taking up sort of a different thread. And I really appreciated how that worked. It did keep it interesting for me.
Thank you. I was just going to say, well, among my operating principles is you have to think about the reader. You have to think about what the reader needs, what the reader wants. Every sentence, every paragraph, I'm thinking about the reader. Is the reader bored with this long explanation of epigenetics or meiosis and mitosis or whatever? Does the reader need a joke or a change of subject or a change of venue or a change of tone? So heterogeneity, variation, surprise are as important as the inevitability of following a narrative and an intellectual thread that eventually takes you where you want to go. It's a combination of braiding all those things together is what I try to do.
One of the things that interests me, I'm interested in your comments on this, is one of the ways I look at writing is that life and thought are not linear, okay? They're all jumbled up and really complicated. And to me, one of the challenges of writing is to linearize that, okay? Because writing is linear. Does that make any sense?
It does in a sense, yes. But I also think that books should not be purely linear. They should have. I think of a book not as a linear story or recitation. I think of a book as a mosaic. And again, I've said this before. When I write a nonfiction book, I think of it as creating a large mosaic on the side of a building, for instance, of a Chinese dragon breathing flame, with a spiked tail and a great arched back and many different colors of green and gray and black and orange and yellow, and maybe a little white clown sitting on a saddle on this dragon. And you create this mosaic using little pieces of ceramic tile, each of which is only a single color. it's orange, it's teal, it's scarlet. And you put these little mosaic pieces together, and from a distance, they seem to blend. Each one is just a square and it's just one color, but from a distance, you have this magnificent, we hope it's magnificent, picture, this living form. And each of those little mosaic tiles is a fact, is a piece of data, is something that you can't change, you can't bend, you can't shape, you can't blur. It is a particulate fact. So that's my mental model for making books of scientific nonfiction read as though hopefully they are espionage novels.
I totally see that. I totally see that. I would read from chapter to chapter, and it's kind of jumping around. And I saw, I would have tried to put it linearly because that's the scientist in me, right? But you did make this beautiful mosaic that works. Really get it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and thinking about the fact that I use a lot of your writing in teaching, when I teach my HIV seminar and have students reading Chimp in the River, it is very much that style that helps make it palatable to students and make it something that they can get into, because the fact that they're sort of going forward but then coming back helps them link into, oh, right, I knew about this. I know some things about this again. And so I think that that's actually what makes your works very successful and very useful in an educational setting.
Thank you, Brianne, especially for mentioning that the Chimp in the River, that little book, about 110-page book that came out of my longer book Spillover. That's an important piece of writing to me. I think maybe that's the most important 110 pages I've ever written.
Well, I assign it in at least 2 classes, sometimes more.
Great to hear that. Thank you.
David, so this is interesting because I wanted to ask you about your actual process. So you told me the other day you did all your writing in that room, and I read some of your paragraphs and I think this is perfectly stated. I wonder how long it took him to write this. Do some paragraphs just take a long time, and do they take hours, or are they all?
Oh yeah. Sometimes, if things are really difficult, sometimes at the end of a day, I work pretty hard when I'm in the writing phase. I might write for 5 or 6 hours, broken into 2 shifts, and that burns a lot of energy. Anybody who writes knows that writing for 5 or 6 hours is pretty exhausting, maybe a little bit more some days. And there are some times when, if I get a page of first draft and maybe converted to second draft in that 5 or 6 hours, I'm happy. I'm more happy if I get 3 pages. Usually what I do is in the morning I write first draft, and then I take a break. In the morning I try and write a second draft of yesterday's pages to start me off. And then in the afternoon, I push ahead a little bit more recklessly with first draft of another set of 1 to 3 pages. But sometimes though, Vincent, sometimes the beautiful things come easily. The difficulty of a given paragraph or a given passage does not correlate perfectly with its lasting value, with whether you're going to keep it or just throw it away. Sometimes you work really, really hard on something and then you say, I had to do that, but now I'm going to throw that away because the reader doesn't have to read that. I just had to do that to get from point A to point C, but the reader doesn't have to read B.
How many drafts do you end up going through, mentioning first and second drafts?
I would say between 47 and 112.
Okay.
That's good.
Lots.
That's a great answer. So, David, you talked to a lot of people. You read a lot for this book, as you usually do. What do you do with that information to get it ready for writing a paragraph?
Yeah. Well, if I'm reporting a book, as I used to do, going out to the Congo and to caves in China and places around the world, I would come back with these and these. notebooks, moment by moment notebooks that I carry with me on the trail and scribble a comment, a fact, an observation in as we go. And then I stuff it back in its Ziploc bag with the ballpoint pen so that when we cross the swamp or get rained on, it doesn't get destroyed. And then at 4 or 5 in the morning, I enter my record of yesterday into a little sort of journal like this. But I couldn't do any of that with this book. I sat in front of this laptop in this room and Zoomed with my 95 sources. I had my trusted transcriber, Gloria, transcribe those. I had journal papers piled up high. I've got files, standing files and file cabinets over here. I had all these files. So I read and annotated, and I read and annotated. And then I just started to write. And I don't make outlines. I don't outline books. I want this organic structure. I want the book to grow like a crystal, and not to be, not to be put down in an orderly way like steps on a ladder. So I sit at the desk and I drink coffee until I go into a trance, and then I decide, I think this book should open with Henry Yees Lee working in the lab of Susan Weiss and talking with his friends back in Shanghai on WeChat about this atypical pneumonia that's putting people into the hospital in Wuhan. And so I start with Henry Lee, and then I put in a little bit of Susan Weiss, and then I say, well, let's see. ProMed was very important right at the beginning, so I'll take my interview with Marjorie Pollack, deputy editor of ProMed, and I'll advance the story in her voice. And then whose voice can I use to advance the story after that? There's KYUN, this wonderful scientist in Hong Kong, who made some early observations with his team about the fact that this new virus was transmissible from asymptomatic cases, and first of all, transmissible, and not just directly contracted from some source, and secondly, transmissible from asymptomatic cases. And so I'll use my interview with KYUN to advance the story there, and that's how I proceed.
So all of this is really fascinating and makes me think about the length of this process, and makes me even more impressed that we have this book now in 2022, that you've managed to do all of these things so quickly. So when did you decide to start writing about SARS-CoV-2, and what made you decide to start on this process?
I'll first of all say, Brianne, 2021 was a very busy year for me. I've never worked harder than I worked in 2021, and I hope I never work that hard again. But the way it happened, the short version is, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that ran January 28th, 2020, because an op-ed editor emailed me one day and said, hey, Quammen, it's time for you to do another op-ed for us. Anything on your mind? For instance, maybe even this virus in Wuhan. And I said, yeah, this virus in Wuhan. So I wrote an op-ed saying, people, this could be serious. This could be big. Because I listened to virologists, I listened to my expert contacts and friends, and I knew this fit the parameters of what could be the next big one. So I said that, and then I got on a plane for Australia, and I spent a month in Tasmania, the southern state of Australia, following Tasmanian devil biologists around in the book, as they study the phenomenon of a genuinely contagious cancer among Tasmanian devils, for a book that I was on contract to write for Simon & Schuster about cancer as an evolutionary phenomenon. Cancer and evolution.
Oh, I like it. I like that's the Tasmanian devil story. I'm ready for that book now too. I've wanted to write that book for 15 years. I did a Harper's cover story on this about 15 years ago, and I've wanted, maybe longer, I've wanted to write that book ever since. So I finally was doing that, and then I flew back from Tasmania on March 2nd of 2020, and we can all remember where things stood roughly about then. At that point, everybody was starting to say, yeah, this could be a pandemic any minute.
And my dear publisher, Simon & Schuster, talked to my agent, my dear agent, Amanda Urban, and they were saying, we want a pandemic book. And she said, well, you've already got David on contract. You should have David write the pandemic book. They said, well, that's a good idea. Will he do it? And I thought about that for about 4 seconds. And I thought, yeah, I have to do this. This is not an opportunity. This is a duty. But I don't like writing books about things that everybody else is writing books about. And but I said yes anyway, and they gave me a nice new contract for this book. And then they said, but we need this book by December 31st, 2021. So that was like a year and a half by that point. I thought, oh, great. Usually it takes me 5 years, 6 years to write a book. And so I spent the rest of 2020 sort of shuffling my feet, thinking about how am I going to research this book, let alone write it? How am I going to make it unique and fresh and original? I can't travel. I can't get on a plane for Wuhan. I can't do any of the things I usually do. So instead, I had double knee replacement surgery. I got that out of the way. And that was long overdue. And I wrote a couple of pieces for the New Yorker, a couple of feature stories for the New Yorker about aspects of this, about the pangolin aspect of this, and about the warnings that had been issued, and had a very good interactions with the New Yorker, a few more op-eds. And by the end of the year, I'm thinking, but how am I going to write this book? And then around Christmas of 2020, I got the idea. I'm going to do it by Zoom. I'm going to ask 60 or 70 of the world's leading virologists if they will Zoom with me for an hour and a half while I ask them about this virus and their work on this virus, and also about their lives during the pandemic. So on about January 1st, 2021, I started emailing people. I made a list of my wish list of these scientists: Christian Andersen, Bob Gary, Ian Lipkin, Marion Koopmans. And I kept adding to that list as I discovered.
So far, all on TWiV. They've all been on TWiV.
Michael Warraby.
He's been on.
Of course. And so I started emailing them, and they started saying yes. They didn't all say yes, but most of them said yes. And I started doing these Zoom interviews, mostly an hour and a half, occasionally more, occasionally less. Tony Fauci, didn't give me an hour and a half, but he gave me a very good, candid, interesting interview. And so I did all those for the first 6 months of 2021, ended up not being 60 or 70, but 95. Got them all transcribed by Gloria. And then in June, about the middle of June 2021, I said, okay, now I got to write this book by December 31st. So I got up early in the morning and I worked hard. And I beat my deadline by 2 weeks. I hit send on December 18th. And nice. Jonathan Karp, the publisher of Simon & Schuster, and my wonderful editor, Bob Bender, were shocked that I had delivered early. But they were very happy with the book. So
that to me, the ultimate paper that mapped the outbreak to the Wuhan market, and by doing a time course, fairly recent, that you cover in chapter 74. I was waiting for it until we got up to that chapter, and I think because I wasn't sure what your cutoff would have been.
Right.
Was that paper before December?
So we're talking about Warraby et al., right?
Yeah.
Warraby, the market was the epicenter of the outbreak. Yeah. That paper was right. That paper, I think, was published in Science in February of this year, but it was out as a preprint in October or November of 2021. Okay. So I got that right as I was finishing, but I had already interviewed Michael. I knew that he was important. He had done other work that I had described earlier in the book. And so I was watching as things came out from Mike Warraby, also an important character in The Chimp in the River for me. And when that preprint came out, I read it and said, yeah, this is important. I certainly need to describe this. This is definitely a piece of the mosaic.
So also you, in addition to interviewing these people, you had to do all kinds of background reading. You read their papers, you figured out what questions you were going to ask them. So I just find it amazing that you could keep that level of intensity up. And I'm wondering, like, after
what
each
else?
interview,
What else was there to do, Kathy, in 2021?
Well, true. But did you do a lot of post-interview processing, or did you just have to like move on to whatever was coming up next?
No, I did post-interview. Well, essentially, I did the interview and I'd get it transcribed, and then I'd throw it on a stack, or I'd put it in a file. You know, I have my Warby file and my Gary file and my several different Anderson files and my Zhengli Shi files. And so I would stuff it in the file. And then when it came time in this organic growing of the structure, where I said, okay, now I need Mike Warby's voice to advance this part of the story, then I would go back, I would look at his interview, I'd have 30 pages of typescript, and I would read through it quickly, and I would make pencil slashes by anything that sounded pungent and interesting. Because you want to use pieces that are interesting, not just pieces that are important. That's one of my principles of science writing, is that you always need to be looking for the point where the vector of what's important crosses the vector of what's interesting. And that's where you focus. So I would do that, and then I would write something and started writing about, Michael's contribution at this point, and then I would realize, wait, but I don't know this and I don't know this. I better email Michael and ask some follow-up questions. So I would email him and ask some follow-up questions and add that. And then I would realize, wait a minute, no, there's some young guy in Glasgow that I have to talk to about this. And I've come in contact with him on Twitter, some young graduate student named Spyros Litras, who works in David Robertson's lab. And so I would start emailing Spyros Litras and say, can I Zoom with you? And so I would add him and discover different pieces of this. Andrew Rambo, I asked him if I could interview him in Edinburgh. And he said, don't interview me, interview my grad students, Verity Hill and Anya O'Toole. Okay. So I interviewed these two young women doing PhDs under Andrew Rambo, fabulously interesting, good voices, inventing the methodology by which we categorize variants, tracking the alpha variant out of southeastern England as it came up toward London. They were doing this work in Rambo's lab. I got lovely interviews from both of them. I was delighted to make them important characters, use their voices. And then if I had a follow-up question, I would go back to them by email. And then, equally important or even more important, when the book was all done and I hit send and Simon & Schuster had it and they read it and said, yeah, let's go. Here's the schedule. Here's how long you have for revisions. We're going to publish next October. Yikes. Then I went back to all of my 95 sources and said, is this accurate? Would you read these 3 pages? Would you read these 2 pages? Would you read these 10 pages? Mark them up on track changes. Don't try and spin me, but anything that's factually inaccurate, please call me on it. I can't deliver precision to the degree that you deliver precision in your papers, but I can deliver accuracy. And that's another of my operating thoughts, principles as a science writer, is what a science writer for the general public does, among other things, is you have to dial down precision without ever compromising accuracy.
So, David, the title really has to do with your breathless work, not the actual disease, right?
Yeah, I was breathless, but these people, the scientists, they were really breathless. I mean, when Tony Fauci and Barney Graham and Jason McClellan told me the story in pieces of their work on what became the Moderna vaccine, that was breathless too. Barney Graham sitting at his desk in Washington or in Bethesda at his home office on the evening of January 10th, 2020, waiting to get the sequence, the first sequence of the virus. And Eddie Holmes is in Sydney pleading with Zhou Zhang sitting on a plane in Shanghai. We got to release the sequence. And Andrew Rambo in Edinburgh in the middle of the night between January 10th and January 11th, waiting to get the sequence from Eddie so he can put it up. Barney waiting to get the sequence so he can start to use it to develop an antigen. Tony Fauci waiting and saying to Barney, just go. As soon as you get the sequence, just go. I'll get you the money. I'll support it. Just go. All of that. They were all breathless.
Amazing.
You said in the book that you liked to ask most of them what was their most important decision in 2020.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what was the most surprising response that you got to that question?
Well, the response that Tony Fauci gave me was surprising to me because it was so candid. And that's in the book, as you know. So what Dr. Fauci, I don't presume to call him Tony, but everybody knows him as Tony Fauci. I asked him that question, and I'm not going to try and do his Brooklyn accent, although the story is better if it has that. He said, well, scientific decision or political decision? And I said, well, you can have one of each. And he said, okay, a political decision. When I spoke out against the President of the United States, when I stood up to the President of the United States, I don't take any great pleasure in crossing swords with the President of the United States in public, but that was important. What about scientific? The most important scientific decision was telling Barney Graham, we get the sequence, you go, I'll find the money. We're going to do this vaccine in record time. And I thought that was pretty cool that he was as candid with it.
That's amazing because in retrospect, I think I remember early on people saying we're going to have a vaccine in 12 months or something like that. And we're all going, nonsense. It takes years.
Yeah.
But it's apparent that that's what Tony was thinking.
That's right.
Okay.
And I did an interview with...
and he had enough insight to realize that wasn't impossible.
He did. Well, Barney Graham had been working on the concept of an mRNA vaccine against coronaviruses already at that point for 5 years, I think. And before that, he'd been working on the mRNA vaccine concept for respiratory syncytial virus that kills, millions of kids, hundreds of thousands of kids around. It affects millions of people. And he'd been working on a vaccine for that for 15 or 20 years. He was ready. He was ready to go.
Yeah, I didn't realize how mature that was.
Yeah.
David, what was your most important decision in 2020?
In 2020? To do this book.
Yeah.
To say yes to Simon & Schuster. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I don't know how I'm going to make it unique and different from the other books that will come along. But yes, okay, sure, I will write a book about the pandemic. Oh, one of my most important decisions was the decision to write the book about the virus itself, make the virus the main character. And then write about the scientists and make them important characters, write about the scientific process and the evolutionary trajectory of an exceptionally interesting, formidable virus, or as Tony Fauci said to me, this is a really nefarious and insidious virus.
Do you think that your previous work writing Spillover influenced that?
Oh, certainly. I mean, Spillover was my running start on this, but there's a lot more. Vincent, when we talked yesterday, said to me, you know a lot more virology now than you did when you started writing about viruses, or something like that. He said it very politely, and whatever it was, he was right that I've been on a learning curve about biology for the last 40 years, hopefully upward most of that time. and learning. And I'm I'm not a virologist, obviously, but I'm better informed now than I was when I started this book, and was much better informed when I started this book than I was when I finished Spillover.
So I said that you really got viruses, and I said, I'm sorry if this is an insult to you, but you really get viruses now much better than you did. And here's an example of why. You're page 147, just coming off your Tony Fauci quote. SARS-CoV-2, a virus without intentions, without malice, without anything but Darwinian imperatives to guide it. Okay? And that tells me you got it, because that's the way it is, no matter what Tony said. Tony said he's anthropomorphizing or whatever, you used the funny word, but you were right. And I'm really happy that you said that, because some people feel that viruses, they have intentions, they want to make you sick, they want to kill you, they want to do all things. I'm glad that you did that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. No, I felt very complimented by what you said yesterday, Vincent.
No, thank you. Well, you had already agreed to come on, so that was not the reason. By the way, in case you're interested,
I can remember. I think when I started writing Spillover, when I started researching Spillover, I remember asking myself, I wonder if viruses evolve. I wonder if viruses evolve. Do they have anything to do with Darwinian evolution by natural selection? I wonder if that applies to them at all. So I found out that the answer to that is yes, and it leads to a lot of very interesting things.
Yeah. No, the difference is that when I was reading Spillover, I would on almost every page circle things and say, no. Whereas this book, I would circle things and tweet them and say, David gets it now. And I really,
thank you.
I think it's important you're obviously learning. By the way, I want to tell you my favorite quote in the book, page 311, Christian Anderson's postdoc, Edith Parker, and I'm gonna say the curse word because it's great. The epistatic fucking Cirque du Soleil of this virus is discombobulating. That is great.
Yeah. Yeah, that's at the end of near the end of the book when I'm describing. I think it's the Martin et al. Paper on positive epistasis in the genome of this virus, and the 53. Oh yeah, the 53 mutations in Omicron, and how many of those mutations are directly beneficial, and how many of them are passengers, and how many of them are profiting from the fact that they're they have a positive epistasis with some of the other mutations. And then right about that time, as I was writing that section, Christian put it up, I think, on Twitter. My postdoc Edith just said something really to the point about Omicron. That quote, the epistatic, whatever, the epistatic fucking Cirque du Soleil of this virus is discombobulating. And I thought, oh man, that's a jewel. That's a little 1 centimeter square of ceramic tile that's just gleaming golden. And so I emailed Christian, I think, and said, would she let me use that? And then I was in touch with Edith, and she said, go crazy, sure, use it. So I'm
going to use it in a lecture.
That was a gift. Yeah. We should all use it. Here's to Edith Parker.
David, you talk about a book has to, it has to entertain people and excite them. You have to break it up, and you have to do the same thing when you're teaching, as you probably know. And this is the kind of thing. I'll take the book to the front of the class and I'm going to read it, so they don't think I'm making it up.
So I'll do my favorite quote from the book. This is in very near the end, when you're sort of talking about your perspective on the various ideas about the origins of the virus. And in the course of that, you're talking about how you may actually be subject to some level of bias because you're familiar with all these characters and you become friends with guys like Peter Daszak and other characters. And you say, I'm aware of the proposition that journalists are not supposed to have friends. but authors working a wider arc of history, character, and narrative are allowed. And, I've often thought about this, journalists kind of standing back and taking this uber objective perspective on things. And I had never really extrapolated that to the notion that journalists are not supposed to have friends. Likewise, I'd never really differentiated between journalism and book authors in the way that you do there. So I found that all very interesting.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you. Well, let me, for the sake of our audience, let me add to that yes, I say, as I say in the book, Peter Daszak is a friend of mine. I've known him a long time. Matt Ridley, Alina Chan's co-author, is also a friend of mine, a fellow science writer. I've known him a long time. Charlie Kalischer is a friend of mine. Carl Johnson is a friend of mine. So there are some people who would go crazy if we merely said that Peter Daszak is a friend of mine and didn't put that into wider context here, I think.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess given that you have a friendship with Peter Daszak and Matt Ridley and all of these individuals, how did you decide to, how did you think about your approach to talking about the origin of the virus?
I guess part of what I thought about, or what I arrived at, and I didn't necessarily think this at first, but I arrived at it partly with the counsel of my sage wife, Betsy, was this: be respectful, be fair to everybody on all sides of the hottest topic in this, which we haven't talked about too much yet, which is the origins of the virus question. Am I more persuaded by one side than another? Absolutely. Do I lay out the evidence that side presents? Absolutely. Do I lay out the evidence or the arguments that the other side presents? Well, there isn't much evidence, but I lay out some of their arguments. And even what I just said there, that can be taken as bias. It's a point of view. Do I have a point of view? Yes, I have a point of view. If you're writing straight news for the New York Times, are you allowed to have a point of view? Well, you're supposed to not. You're supposed to be objective. But as Rich just quoted, and I firmly believe, when you're writing a book, when you're writing a narrative book about science and the history of science, you are a human being. The scientists are human beings. You have a point of view that's legitimate. But it's important to support your point of view with careful research, with facts, particulate, reliable facts, and to be fair, to be respectful. So I tried to be fair to everybody, and I tried to be respectful to everybody except Donald Trump.
So because I listened to the book, at the very beginning, they say there's a PDF that accompanies this. And I thought, well, I'm just going to wait to the end to see what that is. Maybe it's maps or I don't know what it's going to be. But it turns out that it's all the credits of the 95 people that you interviewed and their bios and so forth. And then the credits after that. So I've only just started looking at that. But I just want to make two comments. One is that it seems like you must have asked several people, at least two of whom I've read their blurb so far, Christian Anderson and Roger Frutos, basically asked them, are we going to have learned our lesson from this? And both of them in one way or another just said, nope.
Right. Yeah,
there's going to be another.
Right.
There's going to be another one. We didn't learn anything. So I thought that was interesting. And then, and then because I read the one about Tony Fauci and the interaction you had with him about who is the better person that plays him on TV, that was a fun thing. So I'm really looking forward to now reading all of these because I think I'm going to get some more insight into
thank you, Kathy.
Your process. Yeah.
Let me say that. Say a little bit more about that section for your audience. Who, at the end of the book, instead of just like a long paragraph of acknowledgments with names, I decided that I wanted to do more for these 95 sources who had given me so much time and so much trust. And so I wrote a paragraph, in many cases a longish paragraph, about each of those 95 people. and put into that paragraph basic information about their qualifications, but also some interesting things they said in the interview that did not fit in the narrative structure of the book. Some things that illuminated their character, some things that were just kind of fun, unexpected, and some things that were important maybe. And that was an act of respect and appreciation for them. It took me a lot of time. And each of those paragraphs, again, they fact-checked for me to help me get it accurate. Alina Chan, yes, she fact-checked it, David Relman, yes, he had a chance to fact-check it. Everybody had a chance to correct these things. And I think of them as, the reason I call them credits is because I think of them as sort of like the outtakes from the movie that you see while the credits are running at the end of the movie. Here's where the main character blows a line and somebody throws a pie in his face, and it doesn't go into the movie, but it reveals something about the human beings who were on the set making this movie. So that was the analogy I had in mind with those credits.
I'm visualizing a pile of leftover tiles. Okay, that you didn't get to put into the mosaic.
Yeah. Oh, that's absolutely right, Rich. That's another way to think about it. Yeah. Here are some more. Here are some of my favorite tiles that didn't fit into the mosaic.
So, David, the op-ed you wrote, I remember very, very distinctly in January 2020. You talked about wildlife markets, not just in China, but all over the world, that are sources of protein, and that we have to take care of this. So, the markets in China were not supposed to exist. They were not supposed to be selling trapped animals. Right. So were you surprised that this was happening, and what do you think about going forward? They're all supposedly closed right now, but do you think they'll just slowly resume?
Well, I hope not, but there is certainly a strong chance that that'll happen. When I was researching spillover, I was in southern China in 2009, I think it was, and I was taken to some wet markets then because I was interested in that, and they were not selling wild animals except wild-caught birds, but I did not see anybody selling raccoon dogs, let alone bats or pangolins, in 2009 in the markets. And this was in the city of Guangzhou, if I recall correctly. And I was told, boy, if you had been here a year ago, you would have seen a lot more than this. But now it's gone underground. The trade is still going on, but it's happening in back alleys, on loading docks of restaurants and elsewhere. It's not public like this. But then it eventually became public again. I've seen figures that put the dollar value of the commercial wildlife for food trade in China to, I think, somewhere between $20 and $80 billion, as it was before the pandemic. So it was happening, and you're right, Vincent. It was in most cases illegal, but it was going on. And I talk about this near the end of the book. There is a paper by a security analyst and a scientist named Gigi Gronval that was published, I think, in the journal Survival, in which she presents her idea about why Chinese officialdom has been very closed on the subject of the origins and the market, and unfortunately, they cleaned and sterilized the market faster than the market could be really studied. It was studied a little bit, but it was studied as they were cleaning it or after they had cleaned it. So we presumably lost a lot of really, really important data that could have been gathered from the animals in that market that were being sold illegally. But the fact that they were being sold illegally and that officials had to have been turning their heads at that is very possibly, according to Gigi Gronval, and I agree, very possibly what makes Chinese officialdom embarrassed and closed on this. And that, if there is a cover-up, it's probably not a cover-up of a lab leak. It's probably a cover-up of a market leak.
Yeah, that I can easily understand that. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that is embarrassing, because if you think about what's happened to the world, and it's because of selling animals, most likely. That's a big problem. Yeah. But unfortunately, we're now, as Eddie Holmes said so well a couple of weeks ago here, this has become so politicized, we're never going to get at the bottom of it because we can't do the work that we need to do.
That's right.
That's the biggest tragedy of all is the barriers that have been thrown up because of the politicization.
Right. And as Eddie said, and you said, I think, Vincent, not only have we lost much of the opportunity to sample the chain of supply of those wild animals to the markets, the several markets in Wuhan, and to see to what extent the places where raccoon dogs and other wild animals are grown, husbanded as though they were domestic species and supplied to markets. Not only have we lost all of that potential data, but there's a possibility that the progenitor virus living in some bat population in southern China, possibly at low prevalence, that progenitor virus could go extinct in the wild, and we might never find it and be able to establish that link.
Yeah. No, that's what Eddie said. He said basically these reproduce so quickly, they just burn through their hosts, and whatever virus was there is going to be gone. You're never going to find it.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the things that really struck me about your conversation with Eddie.
So you, as much as anybody else, have watched the lab leak idea periodically boil up and then simmer down, and then boil up and then simmer down. What's your perspective on its current status, and is it ever going to go away?
I don't think it'll ever go away, even if we find a progenitor virus that's 99.6% similar. There are people, I think, who will not let go of that preferred explanation, that assignment of guilt. It'll continue to boil up, I think, but if we do find that progenitor virus, that will certainly tamper it down a lot. I can remember it was, I think, spring of 2021 when Vanity Fair wrote an article, Don McNeil published an article, can't remember the other guy's name, two former New York Times science writers, neither of them still New York Times science writers, Don McNeil, and who's the other one? You guys know?
I forget, but I remember the time and I remember the articles.
Yeah. Anyway, so there was
really...
there were 3 or 4 articles in popular media, and all of them constructed with various bits of circumstantial evidence and narrative arguing the lab leak hypothesis. And people started to say, well, the lab leak hypothesis has gotten more plausible. Now it's gotten much more plausible. And I thought at the time, no, it's gotten much more popular. It's gotten very popular with magazine editors and newspaper editors right now at this moment, and everybody wants his or her lab leak story, but there's nothing new. There's still no empirical evidence to support this. And respectable people like David Relman and Mark Lipsitch and Jesse Bloom were saying we have to keep the door open. We have to keep our minds open to this hypothesis. And even Mike Warraby was on one of those letters. And certainly that was true. Science is always provisional. But there was just nothing there in terms of concrete positive evidence to support it. And yet a great passion among amateur researchers. I'm an amateur. I can call an amateur an amateur. There was a lot of amateur virology and molecular phylogenetics being practiced on Twitter by a lot of people not trained as scientists, with great energy and great passion and time and motivation to go way down deep in a lot of rabbit holes, like the Mojian mine rabbit hole, and commit to memory all sorts of details and brandish them and claim that they're proving contradictions and that and that Eddie is lying, et cetera, et cetera. All these kind of irresponsible slanders, and particularly I think on Twitter, but elsewhere. And I don't expect that to stop anytime soon.
I think one of the things that really stirred it up and resulted in the two articles that you were mentioning previously was the publication of that letter with people who historically had taken the entire spectrum of perspectives on it, following the WHO report, saying, yeah, we do need to look into this further. And a lot of people said, oh, see, even the people who have argued against it think the lab leak thing is credible because they signed this letter. And I remember Ralph saying, no, that was not the intent. The intent was to say, yeah, we need more research. But I think I recall a burst of journalism after that stirred up the lab leak thing.
That's right, yeah. Ralph Barrick was on that letter. Mike Warby was on that letter. Jesse Bloom was the first author. David Vrelman was the final author. I can't remember if Charlie Kalischer was on that letter, and so I need to be very careful about that. He was on the first letter, but I talked with Charlie about this, about among other things, and he's saying, he said to me, should we continue to keep our minds open to a lab leak? Yeah, we should. I've said that, and I believe it. We should. But in this country or anywhere else that is reasonable, you don't convict people without evidence. There's no data. I said, yes, it's possible. And again, Charlie has a wonderful accent, which I won't try to do. But yes, it's possible, but there's no data. Show me the data. Where's the data?
Well, the problem in science is you can't prove a negative. And so you can never say, nah, it didn't happen, but you have to look at the preponderance of data.
That's right.
And, if you write a grant and there are no data for what you propose, you're not going to get your money. So, otherwise, scientists who know that saying we have to look into this when they're, even after 2 years, Jeffrey Sachs now makes a big deal out of it. He's got his Sachs Commission. I just don't understand. And I think maybe you were referring to an early article in the Bulletin of Atomic Energy or something by...
That's it.
Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Yeah.
Who was the author? Nicholson something. Wade Nicholson.
Nicholas Wade.
Nicholas Wade. That's it.
Nicholas Wade.
That's the one. Ooh.
Was he a former Times writer, David?
I believe so.
Yeah. I mean, and people say, oh, look, these reputable people are saying that this is what has happened. And then the scientists' voices get lost. But I think now the preponderance of evidence is very convincing, as you summarize very nicely in the book, which Eddie Holmes has summarized nicely. And I don't think there's any point in belaboring it. Although I wanted to ask you, David, I've been contacted by a British journalism outfit. They make documentaries, and so they want to cover this lab leak, and they say we want to be fair. We want to give both sides equal time. And I ran that by Eddie Holmes. He said, no, why should something for which there's no evidence get equal time? It should get a minute, and then the rest should get 9 minutes, right? What are your thoughts about that?
I agree with Eddie on that. Yeah, I agree. The lab leak school of thought is constructed from this could have happened, and this could have happened, and this might have happened, and this could have happened. And if you hate gain-of-function research, and we can show that gain-of-function research was done in Zheng Lixi's lab, then that means the virus came from Zheng Lixi's lab, even though there's no evidence whatsoever that this virus or anything close to it, closer than 96%, ever existed in Zheng Lixi's lab. Oh, well, she's lying. Well, to say that this virus probably actually existed in Zheng Lixi's lab and she's lying about that this is another way of saying what you said, Vincent. That's a non-falsifiable hypothesis. And non-falsifiable hypotheses are not useful in science.
So I'm asking this question partially because I had to speak in front of a class and was asked this by students So wonder sort of how you would address the same kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But how do we actually communicate this? And what do we do about this question of people not necessarily being able to understand or properly sort of look through all of the evidence? Is there a solution, and what might be a solution?
Well, somebody should write a book that's interesting to read that explains these things.
Wait, that's already been done.
Yeah, you did it.
I mean, that's what I spend my life trying to do, Brianne, and not just me, but a lot of others at my in-between level of the food chain. We try and take what you all do and what you all know and put it into stories that your brother-in-law, the lawyer, will understand and be willing to read.
Central to all this, however, is critical thinking, okay? And obviously you have a capacity for this. Not everybody apparently does, or if they do, they don't apply it. You don't have formal training as a scientist, not that you need that to learn critical thinking, but how did you learn it? Where did it come by? And how do we teach it to other people?
I'm tempted to say that I learned it because I went to a Jesuit high school.
Well, that may be true. Yeah, why not?
Tony Fauci also went to a Jesuit high school.
Yeah, that's right.
You can do a lot worse for high school.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just that. I don't know if, well, thank you, Rich, for saying that. I hope that, first of all, I hope that it's not that rare, that faculty of critical thinking. I mean, most, you can't be a scientist without having that. You can be a writer without having that, but you can't be a very good nonfiction writer, whether you're writing about the mafia or politics or true crime of other sorts or virology. You're constantly dealing with sources. You're constantly saying, I'm gathering these, to go back to my analogy, I'm gathering these ceramic chips and I want to make a beautiful mosaic that's going to be permanent. So I've got this little piece of tile, this 1 centimeter square piece of tile, and boy, it's a really pretty color of teal. I wonder if it smears. If I go like this, is the teal going to go away? Is it going to fade? Is it going to disappear? And if so, throw it away. I'm not going to use that tile. So that's critical thinking. It's crucial for any kind of nonfiction writing, I would guess.
I really like the first chapters, how they establish, how everything got started, and in particular, what we didn't do early on. And so as you were researching this, there's this great quote by an epidemiologist from Omaha. I can't remember his name.
Ali Khan?
Yeah. He said, first case in the U.S., January, 20th or 21st? He says, the next day, health officials should have called Becton Dickinson and said, next week we need a diagnostic. Mm-hmm. And he said, the fact that we didn't is a failure of imagination, which I think is perfect, right?
Yeah.
Did this shock you, or were you kind of aware that this had happened?
No, it didn't shock me. And I've known Ali Khan a long time. I knew him when he was at the CDC. So I went to him early on, before I even had the concept for the 95 Voices. I went to him because essentially he was the main character of a piece that I wrote for The New Yorker entitled The Warnings. So I went to him and said, Ali, you and I have talked about this. We talked about this 10 years ago. The warnings have been out there. What happened? Why were the warnings not heeded? Was it a matter of political bias or money or what? And he said that to me. He said it was a failure of imagination. And what he meant, it seems, is that people in leadership, both public health leaders and political leaders of nations, failed to imagine that response could be 1,000 times more expensive than preparedness.
It's really interesting. The use of the word imagination in the context of public health or science is very interesting, but it's critical.
Yeah.
Now, this is something that Laurie Garrett told us. She was on, I don't know, last year, and she said, we have basically no public health plan in the U.S. That's part of the problem. We have no plans, and when the pandemic started, there were no plans. And she said to us here, and she came to visit here in a couple of months ago, she said, we still don't have a plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And Laurie can be very stern on public health and the politics of public health, but good for her. And yes, we don't have an integrated healthcare system the way they do in the United Kingdom. That's certainly part of the problem. As one of the special pathogens fellows from the CDC told me early on in this process, Pierre Rollin, who was one of the great field virologists who led Ebola responses in Africa, among other things. And he told me, well, and he's French-born, French-raised, but he's probably an American citizen. He's was at the CDC for about 30 years, and he said, problem in this country is that there are two healthcare systems, one for the rich and one for the poor.
One of the things that you point out that interests me is that the U.S. really didn't step up to the sequencing effort. Okay, and how you make a good point, a really good description of how important the sequencing was, and that it be done on a massive scale, and how important the computational analysis of the sequences was, and who participated in that, and the fact that the U.S., at least initially, kind of dropped the ball on that whole thing. Do you have any perspective on why that was? Why we weren't sort of better in the game on that?
I don't have an overriding answer for that in terms of the U.S. There were people in the U.S., Christian Anderson was one of them, who realized early that sequencing was going to be important in order to be able to track where this virus is and how it's changing, what it's doing. And Christian had that awareness, partly because he had worked the 2014-2016 Ebola outbreak in those 3 West African countries. He was a postdoc in Pardis Sabeti's lab at that point, if I recall correctly. So he was there. Andrew Rambo was there in West Africa. I think they were in Liberia. Bob Gary was there because he had a long-term health project in one of those countries, and that was where genomic epidemiology really got its first significant field test, I think it's fair to say, with Ebola 2014, 2016. And they started sequencing samples. And then, among other things, they could see from sequencing samples, first of all, and importantly, that whole outbreak that infected 27,000 people and killed 11,000 people began with one spillover. There was a single person who got it from its animal reservoir and passed it to everybody. Probably, or possibly, a poor little boy in the village of Meliandou in southeastern Guinea. So that was genomic epidemiology, trial number 1. Well, to some extent, it was trial number 2. In SARS-1 in 2003, there had been a little bit of sequencing, as I recall. But, of course, sequencing got cheaper and cheaper and more efficient. And then in the case of this pandemic, it was the people in the United Kingdom. And I tell the story of Sharon Peacock, one of my favorite characters in this book. Sharon Peacock of Cambridge University, who initiated, masterminded the COG UK consortium, the Coronavirus Genome Sequencing Consortium for the United Kingdom, uniting a group of university labs and institutions, including Jeremy Farrar's Wellcome Institute and Public Health England and Andrew Rambo's lab in Edinburgh, uniting them all into this consortium to sequence and analyze genomes as quickly as possible. And this is where those 2 young women came in, Verity Hill and Anya O'Toole. And they spotted the Alpha variant coming out of Kent toward London. early on and were able to alert the world that something was happening. So sequencing was hugely important, and those people, including Sharon Peacock, who had started her adult life as a shop girl, a young woman working in a shop, and then she fought her way into training as a dental nurse, and eventually she got an MD and a PhD in microbiology, and she's one of the leading scientists in England now. But she has this great personal story of persistence and self-confidence and hunger for knowledge. I love the story of Sharon Peacock. Anyway, sequencing. Yeah.
The UK sequencing effort, tell me if I remember this correctly, the British government supported that in a big way, did they not?
They did.
Yeah.
They did. Sharon Peacock made a phone call and got a few people on a conference call, including I think, Patrick Valence, the official advisor to the government on science. And she said, here's what we need to do. Here's why. Here are the people that can be involved. And they said, excellent, Sharon, here's 20 million pounds.
Yeah, right.
And can you imagine that happening in the U.S., David?
Not easily. I can't.
But, Tony Fauci could have said, we need to do this, I'll pay for it. But he was pretty busy with other stuff, I guess.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, the word imagination comes to mind again. I think it's it's important that those people were imaginative, sufficiently imaginative, the UK group, to realize how important this was going to be.
Yeah, but Rich, we had Trevor Bedford, we had Christian Anderson, and others who knew this had to be done, but they didn't do what Sharon did. They didn't do what Sharon did, and that's why we're not there. We weren't there.
That's right. But Trevor Bedford and that whole the next strain operation that he was part of, or I suppose leading out of Seattle, that certainly was hugely important in the U.S. Trevor was so busy, I never did get an interview with him.
Oh, too bad. Listen, we're going to do one more round of questions because we've kept you a long time. Although it's kind of payback for all the time you took from virologists. That's how I view it.
An hour and a half from you, Vincent. You're part of my Greek chorus. Yeah.
Well, it was always a pleasure to talk to you. So let's each have another shot. Kathy.
So when is the other book going to come out? The one that you went to Australia for?
Well, I've got boxes underneath my desk with all my materials stuffed in there. I've got another book that I'm finishing right now. Actually, I'm reading page proofs on it this week that's coming out in May about conservation from National Geographic books under the title The Heartbeat of the Wild. It's a collection of 21 of my conservation stories for National Geographic magazine over the years, knit together with a lot of new information, updated reporting, and forward and then afterwards. So I got to finish that book. I got to keep faith with this book and finish that book before I can go back to the Cancer as Evolution book. But I will, if I live long enough.
Brianne.
So of the work that you have done, what is the thing that is your favorite thing you've done?
Well, you touched on one of them, Brianne, that 110-page section from Spillover that became the little book, The Chimp in the River, that tells the story of the ecological origins of the AIDS pandemic and tells it with a lot of careful research and with scientific voices, but also with that one imaginative risk I take where I create a hypothetical character, the Voyager, who carried the virus downstream in his body from the upper Avindo River to in the 19-teens and 20s to the city of what was then Leopoldville or Brazzaville and Leopoldville across the river. That is important to me, that it works for people, that I took a risk doing that. I wanted to make sure people knew I'm not fictionalizing anything that looks like a fact, but this is a hypothetical narrative to help us bridge this gap between facts that we know. And it became The Chimp in the River. It's certainly one of the things I'm proudest of.
And it's such a good book.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Obviously, you read The Origin of AIDS by Jacques Pepin, right? That was part of your research for that, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. Matter of fact, somebody just asked me for a website to recommend my 5 favorite books in some field. This is called shepherd.com. I'll give it a little plug here. It's a nice website, and they get people to say, tell us your favorite 5 books in any particular category. And so I said, I'll give you my 5 favorite books, the 5 favorite rigorously scientific books about scary viruses. And Jacques Pepin, The Origins of AIDS, is one of them. Charlie Kalischer, Impenetrable Veil, is one of them. Eddie Holmes, The Evolution and Emergence of RNA Viruses, is one of them. Peter Piot, No Time to Lose, is one of them. And then back to Plagues and Peoples by William McNeill. But anyway, that Jacques Pepin book was very important to me, yeah.
Yeah, we've been asked to get him on to TWiV. I'm trying to get in touch with him. It's not easy.
Yeah,
you don't have a contact, do you, David?
I don't, no. I've never had communications with him.
Rich, your question.
I don't think you've already answered it with that last bit, but what's your favorite book? Any category.
Any category?
Any category.
Absalom, William Faulkner. Published in about 1936. The most Faulknerian of all Faulkner novels. Intricate, complicated, layered narration, bringing the story together from multiple voices, provisional knowledge being corrected as new knowledge becomes available. Dramatic story of an obsessed man trying to build a legacy, a lineage in turn of the century Mississippi. Absalom.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to just highlight 3 things that I highlighted in the book because they're good. The first one on page 59, you're talking about the Ebola response and how, it provoked some fear and xenophobia in the U.S., you write, not from scientists, but among ordinary folk and reckless public commentators who didn't pause to absorb the fact that while virulent, it's not transmissible. I like this phrase, reckless public commentators, because I think the COVID pandemic has been full of them as well. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a problem. Can I tell you a quick story about reckless public commentators in the West African Ebola outbreak?
Of course.
Because I had published Spillover, I was one of the people who was invited to be a talking head at the time of that, trying to explain this to the American people. And so Anderson Cooper started inviting me on his show. So I did 4 or 5 evenings on the Anderson Cooper show, and I was all alone in a TV studio in a basement of a media building at Montana State University here in Bozeman, talking to a camera, not able to see anybody, but part of a panel with Anderson and 2 or 3 experts, more expert than I am, Sanjay Gupta and others, and having no control of what he was going to ask me when it came to be my turn. And some governors were closing their borders to people from Africa, including U.S. healthcare workers trying to come home, and people, say, from Liberia. One man from Liberia came in and he happened to be infected, and he died in Dallas, if I recall correctly, but he didn't infect anybody else. People didn't understand the limits of transmissibility of Ebola. It was very, very scary. And so Anderson Cooper turns to me and says, well, David, should we close our borders against Liberia? And I thought, that's really not a question I have any business answering, let alone on national TV live. But then I said, well, Liberia is a country that exists because of American slavery in the 1840s and 1850s. How dare we turn our backs on Liberia?
Ooh.
Okay. So the conversation went on. Anderson didn't blink. But about 11 a.m. the next morning, I'm sitting at this desk doing something, and a buddy calls me and says, David, dude, do you know Rush Limbaugh is lighting up his base at your expense right now? You're this doofus in Montana, David Quonset or something, who is saying that Americans should get Ebola because of slavery.
Oh, my God.
So for 24 hours, I was Rush Limbaugh's favorite liberal moron.
Quonset. That's great. That's
That's
great.
reckless public commentary.
Yeah, but reckless is very good. It's actually a nice way of saying you don't know what you're talking about, and I appreciate that. Just a couple more here. So there's on page 157, there's this wonderful discussion of this whole issue of will the virus mutate? And you write, of course it will. All viruses do. And I want to ask you, why don't journalists get that? Why do they write headlines that say, oh my gosh, the virus is mutating? What's the problem there, David?
Well, one of the things you should appreciate, Vincent, is that science writers write stories for newspapers or online or whatever, but they don't write the headlines. Editors write the headlines. And the editors are not science specialists. So it's never quite fair to hold a writer responsible for the headline that gets put on his or her story. But I take your general point that there are a lot of us out there flapping our jaws, explaining viruses and explaining this disease to the general public, and most of us don't have training in science. A lot of us are Yale English majors, like me and Carl Zimmer.
Carl Zimmer. That's right.
Yeah,
He also got a job at Discover magazine, if I remember. He's doing his first science writing there, like you said, for the outdoor magazine, right?
He did. Yeah, I can remember in the late 80s, I got a couple of messages from this young guy named Carl Zimmer, who was an editor at Discover magazine, saying, "Hey, do you want to write for us?" But Carl and I try and be very, very careful and accurate.
But the problem is, David, even some scientists don't get it right, and they make incorrect statements about mutation, and then they say, well, you're being pedantic, but that's what we do here on TWiV, and most of the time it's for a good reason, that if you don't understand something, you're going to make wrong assumptions at some point. It's going to influence your thinking. So I think it's important to understand mutation.
Yeah, it is, and it's understanding Darwin 101. The raw material of evolution by natural selection is variation within populations. And where does variation within populations come from? Well, it comes from mutation and sex in sexually reproducing creatures, and it comes from mutation and recombination or reassortment in certain other creatures that we call viruses.
Yeah. And so my last point will be from in that line, in the same page at the bottom. This is exactly what I tell my students. Evolution doesn't carry creatures towards some platonic ideal of perfection. It carries them only towards success within a particular environment at a particular time. People seem to that's brilliant. That's absolutely right. People seem to think evolution has this trajectory of making something better and better and better and better, like we need to make better cars. But you got it, David. I really appreciate that.
That's the kind of insight that bubbles up into your mind when you're lying awake in bed at night.
Let me add one thing, and this is a coda to the question that Rich asked me. My favorite book, the most important book in my life. I mentioned one, but there's really two. The other one is On the Origin of Species.
Whereas I was going to say that quote was a thing that I want to go take and put on all of my intro biology slides.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
Thank you.
All right, David.
It's too much fun talking to you all this afternoon.
Well, come on back. This is
can we talk to you and listen to you for a long time?
Yeah, the feeling is absolutely mutual.
So here's the story, David. We're going to be in Bozeman in 2027, most likely, right, Kathy?
Right.
We do a TWiV. I think you should come and do it in front of, 1,000 virologists, and you'd enjoy it. And they would love it too, because you're a lot of fun to talk to. And obviously we could talk for many more hours. And that's 5 years away, so you have time. But you have to do that for us, okay?
I promise. I'll be here.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to send him the dates so he doesn't plan any trips, Kathy, okay?
Yeah,
Right. We have the dates already. We've got-
Unless my Cessna goes down over Central Africa.
Oh, I hope not. I hope
I
not.
hope not too.
All right, David Quammen, author of Breathless. Go buy it. I really recommend it. And many other great books. I'm going to go buy your first novel. I want to read that now.
Oh, no, don't do that, Vincent. No. I was 20 years old. I've done a lot of better things since then. If you want to read something else, read The Song of the Dodo.
I did. I have read it. It's lovely. It's just great. And, there's the last paragraph is just amazing in that book. When you talk about, the last dodo, it's just so touching.
Thank you.
But what was I going to say? I was talking to a microbiologist the other day. He said, I'm so embarrassed by so many things I did when I was young. And I said, we all are, right? You may be embarrassed by your first book. I'm embarrassed by the first grant I ever write. I look back at it and I think it's horrible,
That's how you learn, right? You screw up.
It's how you learn. Yeah. If you're not making mistakes, you're not learning, right? Anyway, David, thank you so much. We really had a great time. I appreciate it.
I had a great time too.
You.
Thank you so much, all of you, for the conversation, the interest, and your kind words about my book. Appreciate it very much.
Okay.
Wow.
That was good. Better than the last one.
Awesome.
That was really great.
That was awesome.
And we were good about letting each other ask questions, right?
Yeah.
Usually we jump on each other.
Yeah.
Oh, that was great. And a lot of insight. And I really do think he has matured as a science writer. I told him that yesterday because the spillover was different, but this is really good.
Well, one of the, I don't know how much of this he did with spillover, but one of the most important things I heard was that he sent drafts of the book to all of the pieces, relevant pieces to all of the people he interviewed, and had them fact check them. Okay.
Well, and that's actually one of the things that I like so much about Chimp in the River is that he had written it as a chapter in Spillover and then took feedback about the HIV section of Spillover and sort of redid it and released it as a separate book. And it's really, really nice in terms of the way that it has been updated.
I've got quite a reading list here from
it's
this
really
conversation.
Skinny.
Yeah, it's a very small book. Yeah.
It's just this big.
Okay.
So when we were interviewing him at the Needle in 2016, I bought all his books, including that, and I had already read Spillover, and he said, "Oh, you didn't have to buy The Chimp in the River. It's just taken out." I said, "Okay, it's fine."
No, it's pretty updated.
Yeah, well, that was him.
At least I find. In the way that you mentioned, you point out things in Spillover, I can see the difference.
I would read The Song of the Dodo, Rich. It's very, very moving.
I got that written down. It's on my list.
Very moving. And the reason it's interesting also for me, yesterday we had on TWiV an editor from Current Biology. Florian, I can't remember his last name, but he just put together a special issue on birds and all the bird research that's going on and that has been stimulated by the genomics revolution and all this. And, it's one of the things we talked about. Powered flight has only evolved 3 times in vertebrates, right? Modern birds, bats, and pterodactyls. But it's been lost many, many times. And he talks about that. There's a whole chapter on flightless birds, right? And the dodo, of course, is one of them. And that one we made extinct because we...
Yeah, I think about this now and then. What an incredible adaptation to be able to fly. It's amazing.
Yeah. And it's limited by, the birds only get so big.
Right.
But he has a picture of, in one of the articles, there was a prehistoric bird, or there was a bird, I forgot the time. It was huge. And there's a picture of it picking up a little pig and feeding it to its babies. It's that big. It didn't fly, of course, because it was too big, but oh my gosh. But basically, there's natural. You can see why someone would start in science writing about natural stuff, right? Ecology and evolution, because you get to talk about animals and they're very interesting and accessible. And then he made the jump into viruses where it gets harder and it's not easy. But, don't you think that reading the book, I would have totally screwed it up because I want to make it linear, and he didn't. He jumped around, but I always said, this is perfect. The next chapter, this is perfect to go back in history and talk about this and that.
Yeah. And I'm glad I asked him about that because, that's why,
it's really good.
Among other things, I'm a crappy writer. I'm this science thing where I got to linearize it, okay? And his response was great, talking about the mosaic.
It was good. Really good. I love it.
Yeah.
Right,
I want to teach students now about how to write with a mosaic.
All right, let's do some picks to wrap up this episode. Brianne, what do you have for us?
So I have a place that I recently visited. It was not my first visit, but it was a very fun recent visit, which is an aquarium that is in New Jersey. It's actually in Camden, New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia, called the Adventure Aquarium. And it is a really fun and wonderful place to go. They have pygmy hippos, which I have never seen before I'd been there. So I always like to visit the hippos. But it's a really interactive aquarium. So there's a tunnel that the sharks are swimming over that you get to walk through, and there you get to feed stingrays, and you get to really kind of interact with the organisms in a way that is a lot of fun. And so I had a great time and was telling some of the people that I was with all sorts of random facts about marine organisms and, had a day of cool science.
Where is this?
It's in Camden, New Jersey. It's actually right next to Philadelphia. So you're on the bank of the river looking at Philadelphia.
I
think I've heard of it, but I've never been. Yeah.
I can't remember all this stuff, all this stuff to do.
It's a really fun place, Vincent.
Sounds great.
In terms of a place to interact with the things that you're looking at.
Right. That's cool. Yeah. All right. Kathy, what do you have for us?
Well, I picked the DART results. And so DART is this double asteroid redirection test, DART. I didn't even know what DART stood for. I've just been vaguely aware that, they were going to try and change how this asteroid was going, and the results just came out today, or some of the results came out today. And so they were wildly successful. They shortened the 11-hour and 55-minute orbit to 11 hours and 23 minutes, plus or minus 2 minutes. They tell you the margin of uncertainty. And they're still working now on measuring the efficiency of ejecta. And so I put in 2 links. The one is the narrative where I'm giving you some of these facts from, but then the second one is linked to within that, but I gave it to you as a separate link. And it just shows you some of the images and has captions for each one. So I kind of thought, somebody came in this morning as I was doing this, putting it into the show notes, and they said, you can finish. And I said, okay, good, because Rich is probably going to put it in and I want to get it first because I don't have any other pick. But then I realized I didn't have much time to bone up on it. And so I said, Rich, if you want to glom onto this one, you can. And so if you keep scrolling down in the images, it shows you this thing, orbiting and so forth. And I don't know, it seems like there's a lot here that I haven't had time to take it all in yet. But
so they rammed a spacecraft into an asteroid, right? That's the bottom line. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've been just kind of following the headlines. I haven't actually dug into this.
Right.
Was that the intent of launching the spacecraft, or did they say, "Oh, okay"?
I'm pretty sure that was the whole point. Yeah.
All right.
Because they want to be able to redirect any major one that's going to do us like the dinosaurs,
And did they manage to redirect it according to their pre-planned specifications?
Well, that's the thing. That's where they said their benchmark was if they could change the orbit period by 73 seconds or more, they'd be happy.
Okay.
And they changed it, 25 times more than that.
Okay.
With their So they were wildly successful.
Crazy.
NASA has such an amazing set of resources, right, like this, that are just so detailed and information rich. And I'm thinking, why doesn't NIH do this? I mean, they have some, but nowhere near as much and as well done as this for
Good point.
all the things they work on. I'm thinking about viruses, right? But
Sure.
they should.
Yeah, good point.
NASA has really good public communicators.
Yeah, talk
right?
about science. Talk about science education. That had never occurred to me, but NASA is an amazing resource of very readable stuff where you can find out all about their project. You're absolutely right. NIH ought to be doing the same thing. Maybe it's a little more. NIH could probably do that maybe with stuff in-house, but I wonder if part of the issue is that NASA projects are maybe more focused. That helps out. I mean, especially extramural science is all over the map, right?
I think they would have to do it in-house. Yeah, their projects, but that still encompasses a lot, right?
Good point.
Rich, what do you have? Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say one last thing about the ejecta. In case you didn't know, the point is that now this thing has kind of a comet-like tail to it.
Okay.
So
cool. Thank you. Rich, what do you have for us?
I got to ask, first of all, Vincent, did you finish with your detective series thing?
No, I have 2 more to go.
Okay. Well, I was going to wait till you were done, but I couldn't wait anymore.
That's okay.
This is not books. This is TV series. Have you seen the TV series Elementary?
I actually watched a few episodes from the first season, and I didn't really like it.
Okay. I can understand that.
But it says that it got better.
Actually, interestingly, my wife and I, so this is a Sherlock Holmes series. Okay. It is a latter day presentation of Sherlock Holmes. Okay. So the shtick is that it's set in present day. It was actually, they filmed it starting in 2009, I think. Is that right? Something like that. It says, I've got my link here is to a wiki article on it. So it'll say in that. Premiered in 2012, ran for 7 seasons. Okay. So it's set in New York City in the NYPD. And Sherlock Holmes, it riffs on the original notion that he had a drug habit, okay, that was played lightly in the original books. But in this story, the idea is, and I'm not giving anything away here, the idea is that he was actually working for Scotland Yard as a consultant. He was a heroin addict and got so down and out that he had to go into rehab. He knew as he came out of rehab that he had an acquaintance who was a captain in the NYPD that he figured maybe he needed a change of pace and he could hook up with him and get his life back together. And Sherlock's father, Moreland Holmes, who is fabulously wealthy, hires a sober companion to be with Sherlock to monitor him with his recovery. The sober companion is an ex-surgeon named Joan Watson. So Watson is a female.
Yeah.
Okay? And they live together in his brownstone in an entirely professional circumstance. Okay?
Great
and she starts out as his sober companion. And this is a critical theme all through the series. But gets kind of hooked on the whole detective process and so becomes his sidekick. All right. Actually, it's interesting, Vincent, because we get these DVDs from the library and they didn't have season 1. So we started with season 2.
So it says in the wiki that it got better. right? Because the first season was not.
So we watched from season 2 to 7 and then circled back to season 1, and I'm not even done with that yet. And I can see, after the first, he's crazier in the first few episodes than he winds up. But, I just love, I love the whole thing. In particular, the relationship between him and Sherlock and Watson. And he's nuts, You can't be Sherlock without being nuts, okay? And it's a different spin on Sherlock than I've seen before. And I just love it.
It's an interesting.
We went back, and so we're partway through season 1, and you know how it is when you have been watching a series for a long time. My wife and I are starting to say, what are we going to do with ourselves when this is over? And Ibby says, well, we could get season 2 again.
Have you seen the BBC Sherlock?
Yes, the Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
That's very
I
good.
like this better. Like this better. It's good, but I like this better. It's a matter of taste.
This is an interesting spin. I remember that. I just thought Lucy Liu's portrayal was just not very good. She stays on in all the other seasons, right?
Oh, yeah. She's there the whole time.
I just thought she didn't do a good job acting. And
she's kind of his straight man. Okay.
Yes, maybe that's it. Maybe.
And so, well, it's good.
I thought she was a bit artificial, but maybe that was part of the character. Anyway. All right. So I have an article following up on my last pick, which was about the firing of the NYU organic chemistry professor Maitland Jones. And this is an editorial in Science by H. Holdenthorpe, who is the editor-in-chief and happens to be a chemist himself. And, he reviews the circumstances, right? The students, and he says the students at NYU wanted to get a good grade. They didn't want him fired. They just complained, and the university fired him, right? Without any review. And they says the student at NYU wanted to get a good grade so they could go to medical school. Faculty love to decry this fact as some kind of cheapening of the motivations of pre-med students, but why blame the students for this? Medical schools have decided that organic chemistry is a requirement and that a student can't get a good score on the MCAT without mastering some of the material. And then he goes on to talk about the reason for this disconnect, and he says the faculty torture the pre-meds with material they don't need. So he's basically saying we're not being right. And he talks about one course when he was provost at Wash U, his colleagues were teaching graduate-level quantum mechanics in general chemistry, and it sent students crying into the halls after the exam. So he says we need to rethink the pre-med curriculum and decide what they actually need and make it standardized, across universities. Good luck with that. I think it's a good idea, but good luck with it.
That's a really interesting perspective. I like that.
I really liked this piece also in the part where he talks about the fact that, there is a lot of passing of a buck with shorter-term faculty members as well.
Yeah.
And I thought that piece also was important and reminded me of our recent Immune episode about pedagogy.
Right. And, of course, David had a pick. It's this Shepherd website, which I'll put a link to for, I guess it's discover the best books, which people are sticking in like him, right? And you can search. So that's pretty cool. I'd never heard of that one. We have a listener pick from Rich, a new way to search research papers, a website called Consensus, a search engine that uses AI to distill findings from scientific research. Ask a question, get conclusions from research papers. Or the AI searches peer-reviewed published sources. Consensus has access to 400 million scholarly documents from some of the most popular journals and researchers. So what do you do here? Okay, let's do a search.
Type
what should
in a
we
question.
Search?
I'm typing in, it wants me to sign in.
Okay. I thought we could just do it. I was going to type in monkeypox. Let's see what it says. Sign in. All right. We need an account. That would have been fun, but maybe next time we can try it out. Thanks, Rich. That is TWiV 948. Show notes are at microbe.tv/TWiV. Your questions, comments, go to TWiV at microbe.tv. If you enjoy what we do, consider supporting us, microbe.tv/contribute. Kathy Spindler's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks. This is a lot of fun. It was really fun to meet David Quammen.
Rich Conda is an emeritus professor, University of Florida, Gainesville, currently in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Rich.
Sure enough. Always a good time.
Brianne Barker's at Drew University, BioProf Barker on Twitter. Thanks, Brianne.
Thanks. This was so cool.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology, the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, Jolene for the timestamps, and Ronald Jenkins for the music. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.